Hello and welcome to the Chintan Chats. And today, our guest, Dr. Rajesh Thadani, is an extremely unusual person because he is a forest ecologist. He has a PhD from Yale, but he divides his time, his knowledge, and his science between multiple organizations. He's the founder of CEDAR, which is an organization that does ecological research on the Himalayas, but he's on the chair of Himutan. Himutan is a grassroots development organization, again in the Himalayas, which works in 2,000 villages. So you can see that he does grassroots work. He's part of that kind of vision, but he's also deeply involved in science, which makes it very unusual. Welcome, Dr. Thadani.
Thank you, Bharati. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Thadani, and if I may call you Rajesh, may I ask you, how is climate change impacting the Himalayas?
So, Bharati, that's an interesting question because we've all been talking about climate change and every time there's a problem in the Himalaya, we attribute it to climate change. But if we look at it, the Himalaya is more prone than other parts of the world when it comes to warming. So the Himalayas are warming faster than the surrounding region. So if you look at the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the rate of warming is higher in the Himalaya than the Indo-Gangetic Plains. But when we look at the precipitation patterns, there is no clear trend. So the monsoon is the main weather system that impacts the Himalaya, and much of the rainfall or snowfall is there because of the monsoons. In the northern and western parts, there are also the westerlies that produce a fair amount of the precipitation, largely as snowfall. Now, the westerlies, which are a relatively small weather system, seem to be strengthening. So there seems to be a little more snow and ice as a result of the westerlies. But the monsoons as a whole, there is no discernible trend. In some parts, there are reports that there is higher rainfall. We would expect a little bit of higher rainfall. In other parts, there is no change or even a slight drop in rainfall. But what is happening and the pattern that is coming, which is leading to a lot of the worrying trends related to precipitation, is that the periodicity of the rainfall is changing. So what's happening is that the rain is occurring in a more concentrated manner over shorter periods of time. So when rainfall occurs, it's a little bit more intense. And when the drought periods occur, they tend to be longer as well. So the periodicity of rainfall is really the big change that's happening because of climate change, in addition to, of course, warming, which has a whole load of consequences.
So, every summer we read about floods, the last 2 summers in particular. And would you link that with climate change? Do you think the shift in precipitation is the primary factor for these floods?
So the Himalayas are mountains. They're steep mountains, fragile mountains. There have always been floods happening there. Even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you'll find records of floods. So floods do occur occasionally or regularly. But yes, the intensity of floods and the frequency of floods has both been impacted by a host of human activities. Climate change, and I'll include that as a human activity, being the most severe. So one, as I said, the periodicity of rainfall is changing. So instead of having rain, in the old days, there used to be what we used to call the Satjhara, 7 days of continuous rain, which would occur in the central Himalaya, for example. Those tend to be little less common. What happens is that the rainfall occurs in a more concentrated manner. Now, the moment rainfall occurs in a more concentrated manner, it has to come down from the hills in a more concentrated manner, and that leads to floods. So that's one reason. The other reason that we've been having some of the very devastating floods that we've been reading about, be it in Sikkim last year in 2023, or be it in Kedarnath in 2013, is, yes, due to this intense rainfall, but also due to what we call GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, which happen when lakes that are formed at the terminal moraine of a glacier get breached, the moraine breaks, and the water flows down. So both of these reasons are leading to stronger floods in the Himalaya.
So tell me, you talked of glaciers, and there's a whole set of conversations and scientific data that is quite worrying because it suggests that glaciers are melting all over the world. What's the case? What's happening in the Himalayas?
So in the Himalayas as well, there is clear evidence of glacial melt from almost across the Himalaya. Much of that is because of warming. There is an increase in global temperatures, which of course leads to melting of glaciers, and that's the common reason across the world. In the Himalaya, there is another reason as well, which is more direct human activities. Biomass burning, forest fires, just cooking on with a wood stove, automobile exhaust, all of these release pollutants, in particular fine particles of carbon known as black carbon. These particles of carbon spread with atmospheric circulation, they settle down on glaciers, and they make the glaciers essentially less white. In scientific terminology, we say the albedo goes down. The reflectivity of the glacier goes down because of these black particles. And if they are less reflective, it means they're more absorbative. It means that they absorb more of the sun's heat. So a less white object will heat up faster, will again melt faster. And that's another reason for glacial decline. But what's interesting also in the Himalaya is that glaciers are not uniformly declining across the Himalaya. So you're seeing more decline, more melting in the central Himalaya, in the eastern Himalaya. But in parts of the northwestern part, in the Karakoram Himalayas, actually because of the strengthening of the westerlies, there seems to be no decline happening in the glaciers there. So yes, as a generalization though, there is glacial melt almost across the Himalaya.
How does this glacial melt impact springs? Because springs, when we think of the Himalayas, when we look at these posters everywhere, there's always a beautiful spring somewhere with little green moss everywhere. So, what's happening there?
So these are two very linked but also distinct systems. When a glacier melts, which is in the summer or late summer in particular, is when it's melting at its most, there's water that is released which flows down as mountain streams. But also there is some recharge of mountain aquifers. So because the water is released relatively slowly, it can get into mountain aquifers. It forms a sort of water table under the mountain, and where that water table intersects, impermeable, permeable zones intersect, the water comes out as a spring. But the drying of springs is much more than glaciers, because a lot of the drying of springs that has been reported is from populated areas. You hear about it in Almora and Nainital, where none of these springs are actually fed by glaciers. These are springs that are fed by just plain rainfall. So when rainfall falls in the mountains, if it is held long enough in a place, the water will gradually seep into the soil and again recharge mountain aquifers. And that actually brings me to a very important aspect of mountain and mountain hydrology, which we should perhaps discuss more, is the mountain aquifer, which is not adequately discussed. We talk about glaciers, we talk about streams, but there is actually very little water that is present in streams. Yes, glaciers have lots of water. The Himalaya, also known as the third pole, there is some 7,000 cubic kilometers of water that is there as snow and ice. But there is also a large amount of water, we don't know the exact amount, but perhaps comparable or more, which is in mountain aquifers, which is essentially the water table of mountains. But unlike water tables or aquifers in the plains where water just permeates and then just stays there unless we extract it from a tube well or a bore well or something, in the mountains it permeates into the mountain and then it comes out as a mountain spring somewhere wherever the water finds a path. So the degradation of mountain landscapes, which is slowing down the permeation of water into the mountain aquifer, is one major reason why springs are drying up.
I see. I see. So, actually, we don't talk about mountain aquifers at all. And I think it's quite important that you've brought this up, because I have another question linked with aquifers, which is, and please correct me because I'm not the scientist here, but that would impact forests, and that would greatly impact also grasslands and forests and in the upper regions as well. So, what's the impact that we're seeing on forests?
Yeah, so aquifers impact forests and forests impact aquifers. And I'll start from how forests impact aquifers before I go into aquifers impacting forests. Um, when rain falls on a mountain, it will just flow down. Some of it will stay in the soil and permeate into the soil, and some of the water will get into the mountain aquifer. But when we degrade areas, when we cut down the forest, the soil gets more compacted. It has less permeability. The water flows down more easily, and it leads to the floods that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. The water just gushes into streams, creates erosion, and creates floods in the plains below. But if we have a good forest cover, if we have a rich layer of humus in the soil, and we have all those fallen leaves which are there in the soil and forming a sort of spongy mass, the water gets much more opportunity to stay in the soil and permeate into the mountain. And that recharges mountain aquifers. That leads to healthier springs, which flow with higher velocity and, more importantly, which flow all through the year. There are many kinds of springs. Some of them will be ephemeral, as in they won't last all year round. But by and large, when we can get more water to permeate into the mountain, you're going to have better springs in that mountain. And the water that permeates into the mountain can take days, weeks, or months before it reaches an outlet in the form of a spring. So often what we find is that, and in fact, all the springs that we find that are flowing in the spring and the summer, which is when we need it most, which is when agricultural activity is highest, which is when tourism is highest, and the need for this water is highest, those are springs that were recharged perhaps in the monsoon the previous year. And those springs allow livelihoods to exist in the Himalaya. Those springs allow agriculture to occur in the Himalaya. And those springs are also responsible for helping the forest stay green, because the water that flows down from those springs helps replenish, as you said, grasslands, forests, and all kinds of ecosystems, and ensures that the flora and fauna stays healthy and alive even during the dry season when there can be very little rainfall.
Well, I just want to deviate a little bit right now, because all forests are not the same. And there's been a lot of talk in popular media and so on and so forth, even writings, that some forests in the Himalayas are positively not ecologically desirable, including pines. So what should we make of this?
So we go into the concept of ecosystem services. And I think when we talk about the Himalayan forests now, or Himalayan ecosystems, we really need to talk about ecosystem services. Put simply, ecosystem services are those services that emanate from natural ecosystems which are of use to human beings. So that could be water, as we talked about, from springs. It could be carbon sequestration. It could be watershed protection, preventing soil from flowing down and clogging up reservoirs and dams. Now, every ecosystem will provide different kinds of ecosystem services. Some are rich in biodiversity, some are very good at sequestering carbon, some are good at creating clean water. By and large, I can say with some confidence that every kind of forest is better than not having forest at all. So, pines are very badnaam now when it comes to the central Himalaya, and people talk about cheer pine as being an exotic and being bad for the ecosystem. But cheer pine is far better than not having a forest at all. Cheer pine is also an indigenous tree. It is a tree that has been part of the forest ecosystem for millions of years, far longer than human beings have been around for sure, and hundreds of times longer. But it provides a different set of services from oak. When it comes to hydrological services, when it comes to providing higher levels of moisture, for a variety of reasons, the oaks do a far better job. The pines do use a fair bit of water, but they use a fair bit of water because they also grow faster than many other species. So they also sequester more carbon, which again today is considered a fairly vital ecosystem services. So oaks and pines are different in the way they behave, but they're different. Like humans from different cultures would be different habits, different ways, different lifestyles essentially. A pine tends to shut down very quickly when there is a shortage of water, and so it becomes relatively dormant in a sense. Dormant is perhaps not the right word, but quiescent. Whereas an oak continues to photosynthesize even when there is a lack of water by drawing in water from fairly deep layers of the soil and often releasing it in superficial layers, thereby creating a more favorable moisture environment. So they're different in the way they behave, but both are important trees. And I really dislike the fact that pines are sometimes so badnaam in the Himalayan ecosystem. They are also useful trees, though when it comes to services that are of use to local populations, oaks are much more useful.
So, coming back to this point, I also read that, and I learned that a lot of the pine leaves are why you had forest fires. Now, is that because you have monocultures of pines, or is that a changing use? What should we make of this then?
So pine forests are not particularly diverse, and pine tends to often form the majority of a stand. So it creates a monoculture-like situation. But naturally, but that is fairly common across the Himalaya. Even the oaks will often form fairly pure stands, as we call them, fairly almost monoculture-like. Now, the falling of needles of pine, yes, pine needles are highly combustible. But we need to get to the fundamental question: why do fires occur in the Himalaya? In the Indian Himalaya, in across the Himalaya, most fires are caused by human beings. Almost all fires. Unlike some parts of the world, California, for example, where you have lightning strikes which cause fires, fires caused by lightning or other natural agents in the Himalaya are almost non-existent. 99.9% of the fires are caused by human beings. And yes, pine leaves are much more combustible. They make for some spectacular fires, which in this age of Instagram and Facebook get filmed, and then there is lots of hype every year in the spring about how all Himalayan forests are burning down. But the damage caused by these fires is not very extensive, because the fires that you see caused by pine needles are largely ground fires, which means they sweep along the ground, they burn all the litter, they form flames 3, 4, 5 feet high and look fairly spectacular, but they don't burn the forest. If you go back to that forest after the monsoon, you will find that it looks relatively unchanged. It looks like it did
Really?
a few months ago. But there are two things it does. One, yes, it impacts the ground habitat. It will impact regeneration, so it prevents other species from coming in, and that's one of the ways in which pine guards that space to itself. It prevents oaks and other species from establishing if fires occur frequently. And of course, it damages the soil biodiversity, the ground diversity a bit. Um, the other thing to keep in mind, since we talked about climate change, is that a few percentage of these fires, maybe 2-3%, move from being ground fires to crown fires, which means the fire manages to climb up into the crown of the tree, and the crown of the tree starts burning. That's a much hotter fire. That's a much more destructive fire. That can actually kill the tree, and it can spread from pine forest to oak forest to any kind of forest. And those do result in tree mortality. But as of now, they're mostly ground fires, and only in a few bad fire years, 2016 being one that comes to mind, um, do some of these fires actually become crown fires and kill off forests. But most of them are not very destructive when it comes to the forest.
So, even crown fires would be largely due to human activities.
All fires in the Himalaya are largely due to human activities. They occur for a couple of reasons. In pine forest, fires are especially common because pine needles are very slippery. So when people are grazing or walking down those forests or grazing their cattle, there is a higher chance of slipping, falling, hurting oneself. If you burn the pine needles, it releases the nutrients. A, the surface becomes less slippery. B, the nutrients get released and lead to very good grass growth a few months later, which makes great grazing grounds for cattle. So people intentionally light fires under pine forest to get better fodder in the monsoon. And a lot of fires are also just intentionally lit just incendiarism, kids going on a picnic who've lit a bonfire and forget about it, or people just lighting fires just for the fun of it, or what they think is the fun of it. So fires can be divided into intentional and accidental, but almost all of them are human caused.
I see. So, moving from fires to another kind of dry space, which is droughts. Are droughts increasing in the Himalayas?
Yes, again, as we talked about climate change happening, one of the consequences has been increasingly long dry periods. So, rainfall occurs uh, in smaller amounts during those dry periods, and also it's been getting much hotter. Last year, for example, even Ladakh flights couldn't land because the temperature had reached close to 40 degrees, which is unheard of in at such altitudes. So the increased temperature plus the decreased periodicity of the rainfall is leading to higher droughts. This does impact the vegetation. It impacts also forest fires greatly, because fires tend to become more intense. And one of my worries has been that as climate change impacts get more severe, some of those surface fires will, or a larger percentage of those surface fires will become crown fires, and that can be very destructive in the Himalaya.
Well, that's quite grim. But do you see solutions? Do you see enough action rolling out in order to adapt and to mitigate?
So we need to figure out ways to adapt, and look at a host of nature-based solutions that can help make life both for local people and for the many tourists who go there more livable and more pleasant. Um, there's an old professor of mine whose tagline used to be "Trees are the answer," and I think in many parts of the Himalaya that really is the answer. Ensuring that forests are better protected, ensuring that forests are more diverse, and ensuring that there is resilience in that ecosystem. Because if we have ecosystems, and again, I should be careful here in adding these are areas which previously had forests. I am a little wary of planting forests in places where forests didn't exist earlier, Ladakh being a good example of that. But across much of the Himalaya, where until about 3,500 meters elevation, traditionally there have been very good forest cover. If we can get that forest cover back, it will ensure that water permeates better into mountain aquifers. It will ensure that there are better springs that flow in the mountains. And it also, forests create their own weather systems, which lead to higher levels of moisture, more coolness, and would alleviate some of the downsides of climate change.
Well, that's a positive note, and I'd like to end on that positive note because it's important to think positive.
So maybe I can add there that it's more than that. We still keep worrying about forest loss, and there are parts of the Himalaya, such as the eastern Himalaya, where forests are being lost. But across much of the central Himalaya, Uttarakhand, Himachal, we are now actually seeing reduction in forest degradation as things like LPG become more common, as people become more affluent and their dependence on forest biomass decreases. So, while there are still downsides, excessive road construction being one, we are actually seeing across many parts of the Himalaya a sort of transition point where the degradation of forests is slowing down and in many cases being reversed, and forests are beginning to come back. So that's a really positive note if you wanted to end on one.
Yes, I do. And thank you for bringing that up. I didn't ask because I wasn't aware about this. But thank you so much. That's news. That's good news. And we're closing 2024 really soon, just a few more weeks. So it's quite important to close it on a happy note, on a note of hope, and on a note of science. So thank you for sharing your time, your knowledge so succinctly. I mean, we could have gone on for hours and hours, but thank you for making it so pithy and concise and for your time.
Thank you, Bharati. It was a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks.